The meaning and structure of argument. Introduction. In this study session, we will discuss the meaning and structure of argument. Efforts will also be made to examine types and ways of assessing arguments. Learning outcomes. When you have studied this session, you should be able to 1. Define and use correctly the term argument. 2. Describe the two major types of arguments. 3. Assess arguments. The meaning of argument. The term argument can be understood from two perspectives. In ordinary discourse, it denotes a quarrel or disagreement, whereas in logic, that is, in the technical sense, an argument is a sequence of statements, declarative sentences, or propositions in which one part, known as the conclusion, is claimed to follow from the others, called the premises. That means that an argument is not just a mere collection of statements. An argument has a structure which is defined by the terms premises and conclusion, and the nature of the relationship between them. Oladipo, 2008. The conclusion of an argument is that proposition which is affirmed on the basis of some other propositions which serve as justification for the acceptance of the conclusion. These other propositions, which go by various names, such as evidence, grounds, or reasons, are more professionally called premises. In an argument, therefore, the premises are intended to provide sufficient grounds for the acceptance of the conclusion. Where there is no relationship whatsoever between the putative claim or conclusion and the reasons given for its acceptance, then there is no argument. To determine whether a group of statements is an argument or not, two questions need to be answered. First, we ask, what is the claim being made? Once we are able to identify the claim being made, we then ask the next important question. What are the reasons or evidence in support of this claim? It is only when we are able to answer these questions that we can say that there is an argument. In other words, a mere collection of statements cannot be an argument. We only have an argument when there is a claim and reasons are given in support of the claim. Let us consider the following sets of propositions. 1. The moon is made of green cheese and strawberries are red. Hence, my dog has fleas. 2. Helen is a physician, so Helen went to medical school, since all physicians have gone to medical school. If we use the two criteria for recognizing an argument mentioned earlier, we discover that whereas the first example is just a collection of unrelated propositions, the second example is not just a collection of propositions, but related propositions in which the truth of Helen went to medical school is supported and derived from the truth of Helen is a physician and all physicians have gone to medical school. The proposition Helen went to medical school is the conclusion, while all physicians have gone to medical school and Helen is a physician are the premises. It is the combination of both the premises and conclusion that makes up an argument. The following are examples of arguments. 1. All physicians are university graduates. All members of the Nigerian Medical Association are physicians. Therefore, all members of the Nigerian Medical Association are university graduates. 2. The golden rule, the rule of conduct. Do unto others as you would wish them do unto you, is very basic to every system of ethics ever devised, and everyone accepts it in some form or other. It is therefore an undeniable sound moral principle. 3. Large numbers of people in this country have never had to deal with the criminal justice system. Thus, they are unaware of how it works and of the extraordinary detrimental impact it has upon many people's lives. 4. Since the elderly have always had a higher cancer rate, and since we now have older citizens, the absolute increase in the number of cancer deaths is not an indication of any kind of environmental breakdown. 5. Since witch doctors are not supposed to serve malevolent ends, and since they often use medicines or magic to help drive off or destroy witches, they are best classified as good magicians or wizards. 6. Human brains have the same kind of chemistry and cell receptors as rats regarding glucocorticoids. So, it seems possible that our response to being handled as infants is similar. 7. What science can't know, mankind can't know. Therefore, all knowledge comes from science. 8. Abortion is evil, not only to the victim, but also to our sense of justice. Hence, it should be abolished. In some arguments, such as the foregoing, the premises of the argument are stated first and the conclusion last. But not all arguments are so arranged. In some others, the conclusion is either stated first or is sandwiched in between different premises offered in its support. Consider the following arguments. 1. Man is superior to other animals because he's the only animal that can ask questions about his existence. 2. The death of God is not debatable. If he is not dead, he should have punished the unjust men of the world. 3. Poetry is finer and more philosophical than history, for poetry expresses the universal and history the particular. 4. All men are mortal. Therefore, the Pope is mortal, since the Pope is a man. 5. Inasmuch as man is created first, man should be the master of all creatures. The above arguments are not as organized as the ones given earlier. It is therefore our duty to arrange them into their respective premises and conclusions. However, there are a few instances where the conclusions of arguments are not explicitly stated. To understand and analyze arguments of this type, we have to study the context in which they occur to supply the relevant conclusion. Such arguments are called antonyms, from the Greek word en, in, and themos, mind. The following is an example of the antonym. If he's smart, he isn't going to go around shooting one of them, and he is smart. The relevant conclusion in this kind of argument will be, therefore, he isn't going to go around shooting one of them. Question: how are the terms premise and conclusion related in an argument? We may refer to a premise as that part of an argument which serves as the justification for the acceptance of the conclusion, while we may refer to the conclusion as that part of an argument which is affirmed on the basis of the premise. Types of arguments. There are basically two types of arguments. They are called deductive and inductive arguments. In a way, every argument involves the claim that its premises provide some grounds for the truth of its conclusion. A deductive argument can be distinguished from an inductive one by examining what each claims. Bellow, 2000. When an argument claims that the truth of its premises guarantees the truth of its conclusion, it is said to be a deductive inference. Deductive reasoning lays claim to a very high standard of correctness. A deductive inference succeeds only if its premises provide such absolute and complete support for its conclusion that it will be utterly inconsistent to suppose that the premises are true but the conclusion false. On the other hand, when an argument claims merely that the truth of its premises make it likely or probable that its conclusion is also true, such an argument is said to involve an inductive inference. In other words, inductive arguments do not claim more than that their premises provide some grounds for the truth of their conclusions. That is why we say that the conclusion of an inductive argument follows the premise with greater or lesser degree of probability. Tip: deductive reasoning is the process of reasoning in which reasons are given in support of a claim. The reasons or justifications are called the premises of the claim, and the claim they purport to justify is called the conclusion. In a correct or valid deduction, the premises support the conclusion in such a way that it will be impossible for the premises to be true and for the conclusion to be false. In this, deduction differs sharply from induction, a process of drawing a conclusion in which the truth of the premises does not guarantee the truth of the conclusion. Assessing arguments. Arguments can be assessed in two ways. First, there are some formal principles and methods that have been developed for assessing arguments. The types of arguments to which these principles can be applied are described as formal arguments. The principles and methods for assessing formal arguments will be discussed much later in this course. On the other hand, it cannot be denied that people have the natural ability not only to prefer arguments, but also to evaluate and distinguish good ones from bad ones. This does not involve any formal and stringent rules or mechanical procedures. In fact, there are many kinds of arguments in ordinary language which are not amenable to assessment in accordance with the formal principles and methods for evaluating formal arguments. All such arguments are assessed informally. In assessing arguments informally, we try to ascertain if or to what extent the premises of the argument provide support for the acceptance of the conclusion. If the premises provide enough support, then the argument is said to be good. Otherwise, it is said to be a bad argument. The criteria for assessing arguments in ordinary language have been extensively discussed in our Year 1 course on arguments and critical thinking. However, the following additional guidelines may be useful in assessing arguments informally. 1. First, arrange the argument into its respective premises and conclusion. You can achieve this by asking yourself or identifying the claim being put forward in the argument and the reasons being preferred in support of the claim. 2. Next, determine whether or not the premises provide support for the acceptance of the conclusion. 3. If the premises provide support for the acceptance of the conclusion at all, determine the extent to which the premises justify the conclusion. Let us now assess some arguments using the above guidelines. Argument 1. All censorships exist to prevent anyone from challenging current conceptions and existing institutions. All progress is initiated by challenging current conceptions and executed by supplanting existing institutions. Consequently, the first condition of progress is the removal of censorships. G. Bernard Shaw. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of arguments into premises and conclusion. The argument has two premises and a conclusion. Premise 1. All censorships exist to prevent anyone from challenging current conceptions and existing institutions. Premise 2. All progress is initiated by challenging current conceptions and executed by supplanting existing institutions. Conclusion. The first condition of progress is the removal of censorships. Support for the conclusion. The premises support the conclusion. Justification of support. If all censorships exist to maintain the status quo, and the only way of initiating progressive changes and executing such is by challenging conceptions and supplanting existing institutions, which the status quo seeks to protect with all manner of censorships, then the first major step towards progressive changes will be to remove those censorships that prevent any form of challenge to current conceptions and existing institutions. The conclusion that the first condition of progress is the removal of censorships is therefore strongly supported by the premises. Argument 2. The life of every civilized community is governed by rules. Neither peace of mind for the present nor intelligent planning for the future is possible for people who either live without rules or cannot abide by the rules they make. Making rules for the community and enforcing them is the job of government. No community can be truly civilized, therefore, without an effective and reasonably stable government. Carl Cohen. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of argument into premises and conclusion. The argument has three premises and a conclusion. Premise 1. The life of every civilized community is governed by rules. Premise 2. Neither peace of mind for the present nor intelligent planning for the future is possible for people who either live without rules or cannot abide by the rules they make. Premise 3. Making rules for the community and enforcing them is the job of government. Conclusion. No community can be truly civilized without an effective and reasonably stable government. Support for the conclusion. The premises support the conclusion. Justification of support. The aim of every community is to civilize, and some indices of civilization include peace of mind for the present and intelligent planning for the future. These, however, are only possible where people live and abide by the rules of the community. Since the responsibility for making and enforcing rules for the community is the job of government, it follows therefore that a community without an effective and reasonably stable government to make and enforce its rules will not enjoy the peace of mind and the intelligent future planning that are the hallmarks of any civilized community. The conclusion, therefore, that no community can be truly civilized without an effective and reasonably stable government is supported by the premises. Argument 3. It is far from certain that the need for government among men rests solely on original sin or man's innate criminality. For no association, however constitute, can exist without a regulatory force of some kind. Even a society of angels will need some form of government, if only to ensure that common tasks are assigned and coordinated. Mokugo Okoye. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of argument into premises and conclusion. The argument has one premise and a conclusion. Premise. No association, however constituted, can exist without a regulatory force of some kind. Even a society of angels will still need some form of government, if only to ensure that common tasks are assigned and coordinated. Conclusion. It is far from certain that the need for government among men rests solely on original sin or man's innate criminality. Support for conclusion. The premise supports the conclusion. Justification of support. It is obvious that the premise provides enough support for the conclusion. For if the state is some type of association, and if no association can exist without a regulatory force of some kind, it follows that the state needs a government which serves as its regulatory force. By stressing the necessity for some form of government, even in a society of angels, who by definition cannot sin and have no criminal tendencies, the premise gives further credence to the conclusion that the need for government among men who are guilty of original sin and have criminal propensities does not rest solely on original sin or man's innate criminality. Argument 4. The presumption that the creation of states automatically means the creation of development is wrong. There are many areas in this country which have seen no progress, even though they have been affected several times by the state creation exercise. A.G.A. Bello. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of argument into premises and conclusion. The argument has one premise and a conclusion. Premise: there are many areas in this country which have seen no progress, even though they have been affected several times by the state creation exercise. Conclusion: the presumption that the creation of states automatically means the creation of development is wrong. Support for the conclusion. The premise supports the conclusion. Justification of support. If one can identify as little as a single area that has been affected by the state creation exercise, but has seen no progress in terms of development, then it becomes difficult to sustain the claim that the creation of state translates automatically into the creation of development. Therefore, if there are many areas that have seen no progress, despite their being affected by the state creation exercise, it follows then that the creation of states does not automatically mean the creation of development. Argument 5. Justification of support. If happiness consists in peace of mind, and an enduring peace of mind depends on the confidence we have in the future, which itself is based on the science we should have of the nature of God and the soul, then it follows that science we have of the nature of God and the soul is necessary for true happiness. So far, we have assessed 5 arguments, and they have all turned out to be good arguments. Let us take a look at a few examples of bad arguments. Argument 6. The Inquisition must have been justified and beneficial if whole people evoked and defended it, if men of the loftiest souls founded and created it, severally and impartially, and its very adversaries applied it on their own account, pyre answering to pyre. Benedetto Croce. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of argument into premises and conclusion. The argument has 3 premises and a conclusion. Premise 1. Whole people evoked and defended the Inquisition. Premise 2. Men of the loftiest souls founded and created it, severally and impartially. Premise 3. Its very adversaries applied it on their own account, pyre answering to pyre. Conclusion. The Inquisition must have been justified and beneficial. Support for the conclusion. The premises do not support the conclusion. Justification of non-support. The conclusion that the Inquisition was justified and beneficial is being canvassed on the grounds that whole people evoked and defended it. But there is nothing in the conclusion to suggest that all those who created and evoked it were not mistaken, and that therefore the conclusion is true. The endorsement of a claim by all or some group of people does not necessarily mean that the claim is true or correct. We have to critically look at the claim itself and not the belief or disposition of the people supporting the claim. Argument 7. It is only when it is believed that I could have acted otherwise that I am held to be morally responsible for what I have done. For a man is not taught to be morally responsible for an action that was not in his power to avoid. A.J. Ayer. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of argument into premises and conclusion. The argument has one premise and a conclusion. Premise: a man is not taught to be morally responsible for an action that was not in his power to avoid. Conclusion: it is only when it is believed that I could have acted otherwise that I am held to be morally responsible for what I have done. Support for the conclusion. The premise does not support the conclusion. Justification of non-support. In this argument, the premise and conclusion are saying the same thing. For instance, the expression "taught to be morally responsible for an action" in the premise and "held to be morally responsible" in the conclusion are the same. Also, the phrase "an action that was not in his power to avoid" in the premise and "I could not have acted otherwise" in the conclusion are the same. Although the subject matter of the premise must be related to that of the conclusion for an argument to be good, such a relation must not be such that both the premise and the conclusion must be saying the same thing. When this is the case, as we have seen above, the premise cannot be said to provide independent evidence in support of the conclusion. What we have will not be a support or justification, but a repetition. Argument 8. Those who say that Ifa is not a science are mistaken. The wisest men and women in Yoruba history have all been interested in Ifa, and Obas and queens and regents of all epochs in Yoruba land have believed in it and have guided the affairs of their people by it. A.G.A. Bello. Assessment of argument. Arrangement of argument into premises and conclusion. The argument has two premises and a conclusion. Premise 1. The wisest men and women in Yoruba history have all been interested in Ifa. Premise 2. Obas and queens and regents of all epochs in Yoruba land have believed in it and have guided the affairs of their people by it. Conclusion. Those who say that Ifa is not a science are mistaken. Support for the conclusion. The premises do not support the conclusion. Justification of non-support. The conclusion that those who say that Ifa is not a science are mistaken is asserted on the grounds that the wisest men and women in Yoruba history have all been interested in Ifa, and that Obas and queens and regents of all epochs in Yoruba land have believed in it and have guided the affairs of their people by it. The fact that the wisest men and women and regents of all epochs believed in Ifa does not affirm the scientificness of Ifa. There is even nothing in the argument to suggest that the wisest men and women, Obas and queens and regents, were not all mistaken about the true worth of Ifa. It is obvious, therefore, that the conclusion that those who say that Ifa is not a science are mistaken does not follow from the premises. Question: what are the two questions that you must answer in determining whether a group of statements is an argument or not? Whatever your answer, the two questions we must answer in determining whether a set of proposition constitutes an argument are: 1. What is the claim that is made? 2. What is or are the reasons for making that claim? Note: it is expected that after a considerable practice in the recognition and analysis of arguments, you should be able to distinguish argumentative from non-argumentative discourses. And even within argumentative discourse, you should be able to identify good arguments from bad ones. Study session summary. In this study session, we discussed in technical sense that argument refers to a group of statements in which one part, known as the conclusion, is claimed to follow from the others, called the premises. That means that an argument is not just a mere collection of statements. Also, an argument has a structure which is defined by the terms premises and conclusion, and the nature of the relationship between them. Arguments can be assessed both formally and informally. In assessing arguments informally, we try to ascertain if or to what extent the premises of the argument provide support for the acceptance of the conclusion. If the premises provide enough support, then the argument is said to be good. Otherwise, it is said to be a bad argument. With that, we have come to the end of study session 2, PHI 202. Thank you for listening.